Congressman Adam Schiff is the top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, and he joins us now. Congressman, thank you for being here.
You bet.
I am reading a lot into that specific line in the memo that you and other Democrats on House Intel released. I am reading into that in part because you yourself have done a few interviews about it. You have talked about that as something that is, in fact, new information. This wasn't just the same information we had before phrased in a different way. This is the first time that we're learning that Russia previewed for at least one person on the Trump campaign that they were going to disseminate this stuff that they had stolen.
Well, that's exactly right. And it is significant because we know from the guilty plea and the statement of the Papadopoulos offense that the Russians told him, hey, we have stolen Clinton or DNC emails. We know from the FISA application and what the Justice Department allowed us to share in our memo that they previewed the dissemination, that they could basically anonymously publish these emails. That's in April, before the Clinton campaign even knows the Russians have those emails. So a few weeks later, when the president's son takes this meeting in Trump Tower with the Russians, with this lawyer sent out from Moscow for the purpose, with the promise of incriminating information about Hillary Clinton as part of the Russian government's effort to help Donald Trump, what's Don Jr.'s response? If it's what I think it is, I would love it. What does he think it is? Does he think it is emails because Papadopoulos was told the Russians have it and the Russians are prepared to disseminate it? It's certainly one very plausible explanation of what he was expecting. It would also explain, of course, why he was so deeply disappointed that what they produced at this meeting wasn't what was expected. Now, shortly after that meeting, when word goes out of that meeting that the Trump campaign at the highest levels wants Russian help, but they're disappointed in what we produced at the meeting, within days of that, Julian Assange announces he has received stolen Clinton emails, which we now know he got from the Russians. So it is significant. And again, it's another piece of the puzzle. I think that when I saw that indictment of the 13 Russians and all its detail and whatnot, what leapt out at me is the same thing that leapt out at you, which is there's no discussion of the hacking and dissemination of the emails. Now, why is that? I can tell you one thing. It's not because of a lack of evidence did all this. There's abundant evidence. That could have been included. Indeed, if that were going to be the end of the story, it would have been included because you'd want to make the most complete and powerful case against what the Russians did, and these two things complement each other. They explain the whole story or a larger part of the story. So why don't you do it? You don't do it if you're not ready for some reason on that piece. And it's not because they weren't ready on the Russian piece. It may be because they weren't ready on the collusion piece. That is, would U.S. persons be included in that conspiracy to defraud the U.S. and violate U.S. election laws? So I don't know that Mueller's reached a conclusion about whether he can prove that beyond a reasonable doubt or not. But it seems to me that the reason you don't include that in the first indictment is you're still working on that part of the investigation.
And you are speaking not just as the top Democrat on the Intelligence Committee, but also as a former prosecutor yourself. And conspiracy, I think, is one of those things that means different things in layman's language than it does in legal terms. But if we're talking about a crime being committed, which is the stealing of the documents, the way that Mueller defined conspiracy to defraud the United States in some of his earlier indictments, I think that we may also see, I can imagine him also describing the dissemination of those documents back to the U.S. public in an effort to influence the election as also being a criminal act. If a person was aware that criminal actions like that were taking place, that a theft had happened, that the proceeds of that theft were going to be used to commit another crime, if somebody was made aware of that, is just that awareness itself, does that create some sort of responsibility? Do you have to go to the authorities with it? If you cheer for that action without doing anything to stop it, is that also potentially criminal liability? Do you actively have to be helping and be part of what they're doing in their criminal acts to be part of a conspiracy? Where's the line in terms of just bad behavior versus getting indicted?
Yeah. One of the reasons why I've used the term collusion rather than a conspiracy to violate sections such and such and such and such is the bar shouldn't be set so low as what was a crime. It ought to be anathema to the whole country that if the Trump campaign was aware of what the Russians were doing, had a preview of what the Russians were doing, urged the Russians to do it. You had Donald Trump speaking publicly saying, hey, Russians, if you're listening, hack Hillary's emails, you'll be richly rewarded. if that message had gotten to the candidate and the candidate is out there egging them on, whether it's a crime or not, it ought to be condemned by the whole country, Democrats and Republicans alike. Now, what does it take to prove a case, or what does it take to even indict a case? I think there has to be a meeting of the minds between the campaign and the Russians. Okay, we're going to do this. There has to be some overt act. It doesn't necessarily have to be an overt act on the Trump campaign's part, but there has to be an agreement. And I think what Bob Mueller may be looking at and weighing is, if you compare this to Watergate, there was a lot of evidence of Nixon's involvement in Watergate. Even insiders like Dean, who spoke in voluminous detail about conversations with the president, it was the recordings that made the difference, though, that gave the Congress and the country enough evidence that warranted his removal. Bob Mueller may be trying to weigh, what does it take in this kind of environment to prove this kind of a case? But I don't think we should set the bar so low. That's Bob Mueller's job. It's our job to tell the country what happened, to protect the country from happening again, but also to condemn unethical conduct, whether it meets the standard of conspiracy or not.
Well, condemn it and, yeah, censure it, potentially bring about some sort of accountability for it. And that's a different standard in terms of congressional investigation than it is for this criminal investigation Mueller's doing. Congressman Adam Schiff, top Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, working on a committee right now that seems to be pulling apart at the seams right now, but hanging in there.